Now, severe electricity shortages have plagued most African countries. More recently, shortages have adversely affected countries like Zimbabwe and Kenya. This dire shortage in power could indicate that the continent is headed for a crisis. The majority of African countries need to double their generating capacity to meet the current requirements of their citizens. And at the same time, South Africa is the only country in Africa that uses commercial nuclear power. Today we explore nuclear power in Africa, and we're joined in the studio, and I'd like to welcome to the studio Nuclear Physicist Dr. Kelvin Kemm to enlighten us on this. Nuclear physicist as well as CEO of Nuclear Africa. Dr. Kelvin, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm very excited about the enlightened conversation that you and I are about to have. And I think before we begin, because that's what you're here to help us, you help us to unpack the situation and shed some insight. And I think a lot of people, myself included, unaware of what nuclear energy actually is and how it's produced. Could you maybe explain us and take us through that process first?
Sure. Well, Vic, you're certainly not alone on that. Now, what happens if you burn something like coal? You have a chemical reaction. You take the coal, and the coal combines with oxygen, and it's these flames, and it gets hot, and you heat steam, and carbon dioxide comes off, and you've got ash left over. Okay. That's a chemical process. Now, with nuclear, what happens is you're getting into the nucleus of the atom. So it's not the atom that's involved in a molecular sense. The nucleus, you can have very small nuclei like hydrogen and helium at the bottom end, and they get bigger and bigger all the way up to, for example, uranium, which is the main one we'll be talking about with nuclear. Now, uranium is so large, it's got 235 or 238 particles in the nucleus. There's two different isotopes, they call it. And this thing is big. It's a big ball of balls. If you hit it with a neutron, you can smack the thing in such a way that it breaks into two pieces. As soon as it breaks into two pieces, it's like taking an orange and chopping the orange in half with a knife. You get two halves, so to speak. As soon as those two break into halves, they then immediately reform into spheres again of two other atoms. Wow. And as they reform into spheres, it gives off energy because it doesn't need as much energy to hold that half together.
It just multiplies.
Yes, so it goes boom, and then as you get that, you get a flash of energy that comes out, and it sends out a couple more neutrons, 2 or 3 more neutrons, which hit 2 more uranium atoms. That's called the chain reaction.
And it just grows and grows
and
grows and grows.
Yes, it grows and grows and grows. Now, you mentioned grows and grows and grows. If it just grows and grows and grows and you leave it alone and you've got a lot of the 235 uranium.
That sounds dangerous.
Then you get a nuclear bomb, which is what they dropped on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki during the Second World War.
Yes.
That is when you deliberately have highly enriched uranium up at 90% and you don't have any controls and you just let it go bang. It's like throwing a match into a barrel of dynamite. Right. What happens today with the nuclear reactors, you have a much more dilute mix, and when it goes off, those neutrons that come out, you don't let them all go and hit other atoms. You have what's called moderators in there, and you have control rods, something like the accelerator of your car. If you put the rod in, it sucks up neutrons, and if you pull the rod out, it allows more. So that's like an accelerator, so you can control the rate of the reaction by pushing the rods in and out, and the moderators keep everything at the right speeds and so on. So that's how you control it. So the reaction of uranium in a nuclear reactor is giving you a steady, large amount of heat. And it is impossible for a nuclear reactor to go bang like a bomb. There just isn't enough in there.
Okay.
So
you
that
kind of
can't
allayed
happen.
my fears, because I think that is also one of the hot topics when it comes to nuclear energy. When you mention the word nuclear, because my mind automatically goes to Fukushima disaster, Chernobyl disaster. I think of nuclear weapons, I think of, and like you say, uranium. Then you think nuclear weapons and all sorts of nuclear, and you just have this idea. I mean, and maybe let's talk about that. The advantage and why people, maybe such as yourself, also argue that nuclear energy is the way forward, or maybe perhaps like an energy mix, not just only nuclear energy, is because it emits greenhouse gases, but there must be some disadvantages as well. I mean, you say a diluted mix, so I mean, the chances of having a massive disaster or an explosion are very minimal. But what are the disadvantages to using nuclear energy?
Well, I would say there are virtually none.
Okay.
At the moment, the biggest disadvantage in nuclear energy is the misapprehension that the public have got, much of which has been deliberately fed to them by the anti-nuclear lobby.
Okay.
And so all the things that people tend to believe that are supposedly scary are wrong. One, it cannot explode like a bomb.
Okay.
Number two, there's no radiation that leaks out of a nuclear reactor all of the time. You can happily go to Koeberg, pitch your tent at the fence where you're legally allowed to get up to. In fact, if they let you on the ground, you can pitch your tent on the ground, you can live there forever, and you're perfectly okay.
And what about the waste?
Okay, now that is a very important thing. The waste is divided into 3 categories: low level, intermediate level, and high level. Now, low level is things like paper towels or whatever. So if you're in a laboratory where there's nuclear stuff and there could have been a little dab of nuclear water, something, if you've washed something that's radioactive with water, that water is technically possibly radioactive. You wipe it up with a towel. That towel has got to be buried in the Northern Cape in the National Nuclear Repository that they've got. You cannot just throw that towel in the bin. Similarly, with any radioactive liquids, you don't just pour them down the drain into the municipal waste system. So everything, swabs, shoes, coats, things like that that go into radiation areas can only end up there. Inside an area that's designated what's known as a blue area, they have coats with blue collars. If you look at the workers at Pelindaba, for example, they have blue coats. Once that coat goes into the area, it's never allowed out again. There's even washing machines in there to wash inside the area. And eventually, when the coat is falling to pieces or whatever, and they get a new one, the coats get put into drums, the drums are sealed, and they're carried all the way up to fall pits where they're buried underground.
I mean, a lot of strict measures and controls in place to secure the waste.
Absolutely.
Also makes it seem very dangerous.
Absolutely.
But, Dr. Kelvin.
Now, let me just mention before we carry on about the other 2 levels.
Yeah.
That is the low level. Intermediate level is something like pipes that carried radioactive stuff through them. Those pipes would be taken up there too, and they're handled there. Now, the high level waste, which is the really dangerous waste that's got a lot of radiation, that is spent fuel. Now, the fuel that goes into Koeberg, for example, are metal assemblies of a cross-section of about that much, a couple of loaves of bread, and nearly 4 meters long. And these bundles of tubes, you often hear fuel rods in the media, and there's fuel rods about as thick as my finger, and then they're bundled together into what we refer to as a fuel element. Those slide into slots inside the reactor. They last there for about 1.5, 2 years, something like that. Very interesting thing is, when the fuel goes in, you could carry it. You're not allowed to because there's very strict rules about how you deal with the stuff, but it would be quite safe for a couple of people to carry this thing as if they're carrying a roll of cloth or something, and it can then go in. When it comes out, it is so deadly that if it's on the ground and somebody walked into the room, you wouldn't be able to walk up to the fuel element. It would kill you. So it's very deadly when it comes out. The interesting thing is it looks exactly the same when it goes in as to when it comes out. There's no ash, no gases, no nothing. What's happened is those uranium atoms inside, like I mentioned, are now split into a couple of other atoms, but they're still there. So there's no change visually. It becomes very radioactive. Now, it's incredibly professionally handled. Koeberg is known to be one of the best-run nuclear reactors in the world, by the way. The only one in the world that is completely licensed under all European legislation and American legislation. A previous far-sighted manager said, let's be safe and get it registered under both so there's no hassles in the future.
Dr. Kelvin, just to catch you off there, we're going to take a short break, but I would like to pick up the discussion and maybe talk about Koeberg, as well as our coal-fired power stations and why we may need alternatives in South Africa and perhaps on the continent as well. We're going to take a short break. The news will continue shortly. We're in the studio discussing nuclear energy, the pros and cons of this, maybe using it as a viable energy source in the next couple of years. We need to seriously look at where the continent is going in terms of energy sources, particularly over the next 20 years. And we're joined in the studio by Dr. Kelvin Kemm, who is a nuclear physicist as well as CEO of Nuclear Africa. Welcome back to Newsworld here on Newsroom Africa, Channel 405. I'm joined in studio by Dr. Kelvin Kemm, who is a nuclear physicist as well as CEO of Nuclear Africa. We're unpacking the nuclear energy debate. Dr. Kelvin, before the break, you had touched on Koeberg, which is one of the only nuclear power plants on the continent.
It is the only one.
Only one on the continent. And I think maybe we should discuss that because nuclear energy, it's a largely unexploited form of energy on the continent. What are the options? How are the other continents, how are the other countries on the continent faring when it comes to nuclear energy on the continent?
Well, a number of African countries now have indicated they're going nuclear. In fact, in Zambia, they've started with the building of their first nuclear center. Rwanda's indicated that they're going. There's a number of them that are looking into it. Now, something that's important to note is For example, let's just take South Africa initially. People don't understand how huge Africa is and how huge South Africa is. South Africa is the same size as the whole of Western Europe added together. The distance from Pretoria to Cape Town is the same as Rome to London.
So therefore, we need more, more demand.
Yes, all our coal is in the northeast, up in Mpumalanga, northern KZN. So at the moment, we've got the coal power up there, pushing into the rest of the country. But down at the south, by Cape Town, is Koeberg. Now, Koeberg supplies about half the electricity to the Western Cape, also making Cape Town one of the few cities in the world that's entirely nuclear run.
Do they have as much load shedding as the rest of the country?
They do, because it's under the control of Eskom. So if something happens, Eskom elects to switch certain people off because it's fair, not because they haven't got the power in that area. So yes, but half of the Cape electricity, Western Cape electricity, is still coal. And that's not a good idea. We don't want to double South Africa's electricity consumption by doubling the fact that the coal has got to go that far. Now, because the fuel of Koeberg is so little, if Koeberg were coal, it would take 6 train loads of coal a day to run the power station, but it actually only takes 1 truckload of nuclear fuel per annum. That's why it's so easy. Now, we're lucky to have the coal, but other African countries don't have coal or gas or oil.
You say we're lucky to have coal, but we also currently have major issues with our coal-powered stations, Kusile and Medupi, design flaws, infrastructure, yes. I mean, maintenance. I mean, it's not performing optimally. And that's why we're facing a major energy crisis in the country and besides the continent. And even President Ramaphosa during his campaign had said as well that, you know, we need other energy sources. And he was quite vocal about, or rather President Zuma, during his presidency, he was quite vocal and he wanted to push nuclear power. So maybe that's also a thing that we need an energy mix. So you're not saying nuclear energy only. You're saying, great, we've got the coal-powered stations. We need the coal-powered stations, but they're not performing optimally now, but we also can improve our energy resources by adding nuclear energy to the mix.
Absolutely. In fact, we need to put a lot of nuclear. We've got 3 sites ready. The idea is from 2010 was to build 9,600 megawatts of extra nuclear. That we should do. But there where a confusion came, and that represents 3 power stations built sequentially. And people came up with a figure of R1 trillion. In fact, the figure that was worked out by the nuclear specialists was 650 billion.
For the nuclear power?
For 3 nuclear power stations in sequence.
That does seem like a
not
problem.
1 trillion once to one foreign country. More than 50% of the power stations will be built by South Africans in South Africa. We will pour the concrete. We will put in the all the electronics, the control rooms and so on. So there's huge job opportunities for South Africans.
Doctor, I get
it's a false assumption the money's all flowing out of the country.
It is. I get that you're saying that we will put the coal in, concrete, and we will build these power stations. But surely we need assistance from countries like China, who's offered assistance because they're quite far ahead when it comes to the nuclear game. But surely there needs to be some kind of mutual benefit for China as well as Africa, or South Africa in particular. Like we can't do this by ourselves.
Yes, in effect, what we'll be doing is using somebody else's plans and their expertise. But a lot of the work, all the construction companies will be used here to do the construction. Now, you mentioned other parts of Africa. South Africa also, a number of years ago, started working on what was called the pebble bed modular reactor.
Yes.
That's a small reactor. Koeberg is 2,000 megawatts. The new ones we want to build are going to be 3,500. And the pebble bed reactor is about 100. So it's about 5% the size. It was deliberately designed for South African conditions, that it doesn't need water cooling. The big reactors have to be near the ocean so that you can bring water through the condensers and the power cycle. The small ones were designed for gas only. Now you look at African dams are like a saucer. When a lot of these countries like Kariba right now in Zimbabwe, Kariba is 25% full. When the African dam is drying out because of a drought, it rapidly drops in height, which is what you need to drive the turbines, and volume. So they're in terrible trouble if the country depends entirely on hydro. I've spoken to a few presidents and people like this of other African countries, and they say to me they cannot build a 21st century economy on the basis that it may or may not rain.
So basically, most of our energy resources on the continent right now are reliant on the weather, reliant on wind, reliant on rain. What about factors, or rather other sorts of energy supplies other than nuclear? Like Kenya has been delving into geothermal power supply. Would you suggest something like that?
That can be done. Kenya happens to be lucky that they have a hot spot in the earth that's very close to the surface, but nobody else has that. So they happen to be able to drill down. South African gold mines that go down 4 kilometers. If you go to the bottom, it's very hot. I've been down there and it's hot. So, you know, in principle, but you've got to go deep for that. So that's not really up for grabs for anybody else.
Yes.
But they are looking at the pebble bed type reactor, 100 megawatt style reactors that don't need big water. So you can put them anywhere you like. That's a huge advantage of those. And our plan was to export South African reactors like this all over the place, which we still can do. It's still a world-leading project, and we know what we're doing, and we have the expertise.
Doctor, I wanted to actually, while you talk about us exporting these reactors, another thing that you had mentioned is that, and I did not know this, that South Africa is one of the biggest exports of nuclear medicine, and I think we must also have that discussion. But before we move on there, the nuclear power plant, I mean, one of the biggest hurdles is, you've mentioned some of the advantages of it, and you know, it's not weather reliant, but there's some hurdles when it comes to this. I mean, cost is a major influence on this. Also, you can't just start up a power plant. It's regulated. So, I mean, South Africa has got Koeberg, but before, Koeberg has been in the making since the 70s or the 60s. And you say there are some other African countries now. Zambia has started the process. Nigeria, I think when you had mentioned Kenya as well. But what's the process there? Surely it takes years. It's not something that happens immediately. And we need to think about what happens over the next 20 years, because demand is here. Yes. And we can't keep up with demand. So tell us about how we overcome the cost structure and perhaps also the regulations when it comes to these power plants.
Okay, well, the cost is not great. You know, that's been completely exaggerated. As I said, 650 billion for 3.
Not a trillion.
So call it 250 billion for 1. We've already spent 250 billion on wind and solar and got very little back for it.
And we're still struggling to maintain that.
That's right. That's intermittent. You'll never get away from the fact there's no solar at night and the wind goes up and down depending on when the wind blows. So for 250 billion approximately, we can build the first big power station, which we were supposed to start doing in 2008, and which the Chinese started building a new one in 2008, and it's now running. Interestingly, in the UAE, they have built one called Baraka, which is now running. And it's, during the course of this year, it's being integrated into the national grid. And they brought in 80 South Africans, 60% of whom are black, and they are putting the reactor into service.
Okay.
The chief executive's personal advisor is a South African guy, and the heads of reactors number 1 and 2, heads of reactors 3 and 4 are both South African coloured guys from Cape Town.
Okay.
So our world class in this game is being recognized like that. So we know what we're doing. So the reactor, to build a new one, we could start today. We literally can start immediately. The sites are sitting there waiting. The first year, we'll be getting the site ready. That'll be at 100% local, getting the ground level, water pipes and roads, access, all of that. The one near Port Elizabeth, there was about a 30 billion rand budget put aside just to get the whole site ready to start building, and that is 100% local. And you don't need to know who your international partners before you start that. Okay. It's like building the car for the garage. Sorry, the garage for the car. You can, as long as you know the approximate size of the car, you can decide later exactly which car. Yeah. So we could do that right away. It takes 6 or 7 years to get the reactors going, which has been shown to be the case by the UAE, by the Chinese, by the Russians and people like that, that are now currently the world leaders in getting reactors up and running. So we should do that right away and do what we plan to do. And as I emphasized, it's not excessively expensive. This image that was created about 1 trillion rand once, which is the annual budget of the country, was completely a red herring drawn across the whole argument.
So it's not expensive. It's not dangerous like how we think it could be dangerous, because there are strict measures and controls in place to manage the waste. On the continent, we've got vast amounts of land and space, and these power plants need space, so that's another advantage to nuclear energy. Globally, what is the view on nuclear energy? I mean, you mentioned China, you mentioned the United Arab Emirates.
Globally, there's still a debate going on one way and another. However, the enthusiasm for wind and solar internationally is waning somewhat now, because there were a lot of promises made about what it's going to do. Here in South Africa, for example, the number of jobs that were supposed to be creating just have not materialized. And this has upset certain trade unions, and I'm totally behind them on that. The intermittency you cannot get over. The World Nuclear Association which is based in London, has got an objective, it's called Project Harmony, to double world output of nuclear. I believe that will absolutely come. It's merely a matter of how quickly the public accept it.
Okay.
There's been a number of moves towards this. To my mind, the world will be running on nuclear in years to come, entirely. I foresee one day when the coal finally goes away, we'll be nuclear. I've got no problem with solar and wind where they're applicable, for example. If you've got something in a area in the Northern Cape with lots of sun and it only needs electricity during the daytime, basically like a woodworking factory that the people come to work in the morning and go home at the end of the day. If they can find that the solar can assist them, then I've got no problem.
Right.
What I worry about is saying that wind and solar is going to drive an electric train from Johannesburg to Cape Town. It's not.
Yes.
Okay?
Dr. Kelvin, I get what you're saying, and you're saying we need an energy mix. And we need to rely we don't only just need to rely on solar and wind. Nuclear has many benefits. That's what you're saying, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, and we know what we're doing. South Africans are world leaders. As far as I'm aware, we're the third oldest nuclear country in the world. NEXA was formed by Act of Parliament in 1948. The American Atomic Energy Commission was formed in 1946. So we're only 2 years behind the US. We're ahead of Russia, China, France, Japan, all of those people, their nuclear authorities came years after us. So it was recognized.
I'm still struggling with how Koeberg is not performing optimally. And
it is. Koeberg is performing absolutely optimally.
Just mismanaging it.
No.
Why are we still? Because we currently still have a power shortage. If we have nuclear and it's like one of the best in the world, and we're doing this, what is still our issue in the country?
This past year, Koeberg was the only power station in South Africa that's performed greater than 100% of what was set as its target.
But
it just runs steadily.
It's just not enough. Is that?
Yeah, it's not enough. That's why we need more nuclear, because they will be like that. Now,
no, you can.
I'd like to point out, with the nuclear versus something like solar and wind, the analogy can be, it's a difference between renting a house and buying a house. You know, if you rent a house for 25 years, you come along and you get the house and it's, say, 10,000 Rand a month, and you agree. But there's an escalation built in. So over the years, it'll eventually end up, whatever it ends up after 25 years, you'll keep paying, and then you don't own the house.
Okay.
All right? Nuclear is like buying a house. You pay quite a lot up front for the capital costs, and then you spend 1.5 million Rand and you buy the house. Then somebody says, right, your bond is 12,000 a month or something, but it stays there. It might vary slightly with the bank rate, but basically you pay it off, and eventually you get to the point where one day the bank says, your house is paid for.
Long term, it makes financial sense.
That's where we stand with Koeberg now. Koeberg is currently the cheapest electricity in South Africa. It's about 40 cents that it costs. Eskom is about 90 cents all around for the coal and so on, but the wind, they have said in their annual report, is 2.22 Rand.
And Dr. Kelvin, then if you're using this analogy, obviously the same, then you'd also have to think about maintenance, because you own a house, you're responsible for maintenance, you have to maintain it. What's the maintenance cost with a nuclear power plant?
There's a standard maintenance cost, but it's not much, in the sense that they run it exceedingly well and they know exactly when things are going to happen. It's rare that there's a breakdown.
And how often do you maintain it?
Well, a reactor runs for 18 months. Well, the pipes and that and the water cooling around, you keep checking all of the time. But as far as the actual reactor is concerned, about every 18 months, like with Koeberg, you know it's refueling time. So they schedule this well in advance, so they know that, for example, that next April, for argument's sake, they will have to switch this reactor off for refueling. And they have a competition there always when they switch off to see how fast they can refuel to beat the previous team's record. And it's a fun thing to do.
Yes.
But while it's off for refueling, then anything that they need to take out, like significant pumps or whatever, they whip them out and they check them. So they manage to try and do as much of that type of maintenance as possible. So there's no need to turn the reactor off at any stage for, say, a major pump that is broken.
And Dr. Kelvin, before time catches up with us, and I want to touch on the nuclear medicine, and I know you kind of allayed some of my fears when it comes to the safety of nuclear, because you know, I said to you, you have this idea, you think the disaster, the Chernobyl disaster, you think about Fukushima as well, but there are other aspects when you're playing with uranium, there's terrorism, there's chances of that, and we obviously have measures in place to control that and to limit any sort of disaster happening around that safety aspect.
We have an incredibly effective nuclear regulator in South Africa, which is the nuclear equivalent of the public protector. There's the public protector of nuclear.
Okay.
Yeah, and the public protector of nuclear can close down anything effectively instantaneously. So if somebody calls and says there's radiation coming out of Koeberg for whatever, he will look into it, and an hour or two later he'll sign a piece of paper and say, shut the shop.
And it would be...
And it's closed, and it's happened.
But the whole area would then have to be evacuated.
No, no, not necessarily. No, there's a little thing like if they spill some water in the drain or something, they can go along and issue an order. So the public don't seem to know. Well, they don't know. I know
there's a
don't
regulator. I didn't know there's a regulator.
It's because nuclear people have been very poor at telling the public the things that they need to know. So a lot of misapprehension comes about, you see. And that is a big problem. But believe me, it's safe. Down in Cape Town at the moment, you find all sorts of people are wanting to build houses next to Koeberg because there's such beautiful land around there. They wanted to build inside the Koeberg barrier that was set up many years ago. But the nuclear fellows say, no, we want our nice barrier. There's a nature reserve on the Koeberg grounds, which is open to the public, by the way.
It's beautiful. You can Google the images as well. So
yes,
it's fascinating.
Any member of the public can go there over the weekend and go for a walk through the nature reserve. It goes down to the beach. And there's a visitor center there that anybody can go and visit, and they show you in the visitor center a number of things.
Dr. Kelvin, maybe tell us a little bit about the nuclear medicine aspect of things. You say that South Africa is one of the biggest exporters of nuclear medicine. I mean,
yes.
That's just another area that we are trying to pioneer ourselves now when it comes to using this kind of technology.
Well, it's incredible what South Africa built up in nuclear medicine. Now, nuclear medicine, by the way, is very important for something like oncology. President Ramaphosa, in his first SONA speech, said one of his goals was tackling the oncology issue in South Africa. Now, it's by far the cheapest for the state, and also, of course, by far the most humane, is to catch the disease very early. Then you have a chance of curing it. Nuclear medicine, you inject a nuclear liquid into the patient, and it goes and it collects at the site of the cancer. One of the world's leading cancer facilities like that in nuclear medicine is at Steve Biko Hospital in Pretoria, run by an incredibly competent nuclear medical scientist there, Professor Mike Satechi. He's internationally known as an authority, and they're doing some wonderful work there. And there's other nuclear centers around the country, but not near enough. So what happens is that the nuclear medicine is made at Pelindaba, about 40 kilometers outside Pretoria, and we export 3 or 4 times a day to more than 60 countries around the world. Just the movement is something which is incredible.
Wow.
We undertake to inject anybody in the world in less than 36 hours. So if there's a patient in Rio, the medical supplies come out of the reactor. They're processed there by a very good team at Nexa. It's on an aeroplane, it's flown, and the doctors are waiting at the other end, and the material is inside a patient in 36 hours.
And that's just the beginning of many other areas that nuclear medicine perhaps...
Yes, there's a whole spread. We're at the infancy of nuclear medicine in comparison to what they think it's going to be doing and worth in money over the next couple of decades. Believe it or not, with South African nuclear medicine, we arrived at the position where every 3 seconds, somebody somewhere in the world is injected with nuclear medicine from near Pretoria, and every 3 hours a life is saved, 24 hours a day continuously. And this goes right through the earth, through Christmas, through everything. Those marvelous people over there work nights, they work Sundays, they work everything to keep the medicine flowing.
Dr. Kelvin, before we let you go, you know, we spoke about many benefits of nuclear energy and how we can be using it as a reliable source of electricity on the continent, and how the world has been using it, and how South Africa is somewhat pioneering in the nuclear energy field as well as nuclear medicine. And I think one thing I didn't ask you is the span. We spoke about the maintenance and the cost, and you know, you've debunked some of the myths around it. The lifespan of a power plant, a nuclear power plant?
These days they're designed for 60 years, and it'll probably be 80. So Koeberg at the moment is about 35-ish, and it's got many years to go before it runs out of life. And so they're very well looked after and very well maintained, and there's a very long life in comparison to things like the wind turbines, which are only 20 years, and even then that hasn't really been tested much around the world. But yes, they're very long life. That's a great advantage. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there you have it, Dr. Kelvin Kemm, a nuclear physicist, as well as CEO of Nuclear Africa. There we go. Shedding some insight into nuclear debates. I mean, you know, there are lots of pro-nuclear energy versus anti-nuclear energy lobbyists, and they've been having this discussion about nuclear energy. Is it a reliable source of energy? I mean, on the continent we're facing major energy crisis. We're heavily reliant on hydro as well as water, wind, and basically weather reliant, those sorts of elements when it comes to electricity, and it is not sustainable over the long run. Even in the next 20 years, we could be facing even more power shortages on the continent. So looking at nuclear energy as an option, one of the biggest advantages of nuclear energy is that it reduces greenhouse gas emissions. There have been some concerns about nuclear energy, perhaps maybe the safety concerns. I mean, you mix nuclear, you think uranium, you think danger, you think Fukushima, you think Chernobyl. So Dr. Kelvin Kemm debunking some of those theories. Also, one of the other theories about nuclear energy is how expensive it is. So thank you for joining us.